They called him the Coat. It was supposed to be a joke, an easy crack thrown toward the man sliding quietly along the edge of the room, gathering discarded napkins like a ghost at a feast. The chandeliers spilled light onto crystal and silver. Voices rose and fell like practiced weather. Somewhere between the roast and the toasts, someone decided that Christmas needed a laugh. "Hey, Coat, come give us a beau," the young man said, smiling the practiced smile of people who run on inherited power. Laughter followed the line like a trained dog. The man they meant to mock bent a little lower, folding a napkin into a neat triangle with movements that had nothing to do with the joke. Grant Miller did not look up. Piper, 10 years old and tucked near the kitchen doorway with a paper plate of turkey and wide eyes, watched the crowd instead of the floor. She'd been taught the quiet parts of his life, how to stack dishes without clatter, how to read the silence in someone's hands. Tonight, she wore her father's old knit cap because "it looks like you're working, and also like you can fix things," she had said, solemn as a child. She knew the routine. She knew, too, the small, private pride that sat in her father's back when he straightened and the room smelled of lemon-scented cleaner and pine. The man who made the joke was Edward Radcliffe, more polished name than person, the kind of confidence built on credit lines and company shares. He could make a room fall quiet just by smiling. He could make people laugh by pointing. He was used to directing attention like traffic. Tonight, he wanted to see someone else smaller. "Come on," Edward called, louder now. "Give us a show. Everyone loves a bit of live entertainment at Christmas." A few plates stopped mid-air. A fork hovered. Somewhere a guest swallowed and pretended not to do it. A woman near the head of the table sipped her wine and turned a page on a glossy magazine she hadn't read. Most people would later tell themselves they were laughing along because it was easier, because social rhythm allowed cruelty if it wore the right clothes. Grant knelt and tucked the napkins into his arm across his chest. The infrared of the chandeliers painted his palms a fugitive red. He had no uniform decoration to hide, no name tag that could be pinched for a joke. He was a janitor, yes, but he was also the man who lived in a tiny rented room 2 blocks over, where a string of colored lights hung crooked because Piper liked it that way. He was the man who had learned to make the old vacuum sing again, with tape and patience. He was the man who hummed lullabies in a voice that tried to be low enough not to wake a sleeping neighbor. When Edward's voice rose again, Grant's shoulder moved as it always did, like the receiving of weight. People love to think of people like him as light. They forget how heavy the world is for those who carry the cleanup. Piper shifted forward. For a breath, she considered storming into the dining room and standing in front of her father. She imagined herself taller by one concentrated wish, like a child who believes in sudden growth. She imagined grabbing Edward by the sleeve and saying something sharp and unfair. She imagined the sentence, "You're mean." It was the only sentence she had that could possibly land. Instead, she clutched her plate, the roast settling like a small, warm promise in her lap. She watched the way her father's hands moved, neat, exact. "What is this?" Edward asked, voice softened into fake charm as he strode to the edge of the room. "You charge extra for the holiday show? Do you take tips?" A smattering of laughter ran like a small current through the guests, some obliging, some uneasy. A little boy near the window giggled. A gray-haired couple in the corner spoke to each other in brief, sharp sentences and pretended not to hear. Laughter, easy, tribal, gave the evening permission to continue. Grant stayed still. He kept cleaning. He worked the crumbs into a pile like a man who had always been paid to make surfaces look like surfaces again, smooth, unmarred, respectable. His jaw tightened. There was a tiny, almost invisible line of white where his thumb rubbed the palm of his hand. Years of polishing handles and wiping glass had left him with that map. He would never call attention to it. Many things in his life were not to be confessed with words. A woman at the table, Lena Darby, Edward's cousin, 25, with soft jawlines and an older conscience, hadn't laughed. Lena's laugh had always been late, like a clock running a half-beat behind. Tonight, it didn't come at all. She watched Grant's hands. She watched the left side of his face where a faint scar ran like a seam from ear to jaw, a mark she thought most people wore as nothing more than a memory of a fall. She moved. The motion was small but decisive. She pushed back her chair and stood. The clinking of cutlery did not stop. It simply looked foolish in the wake of her movement. "That's not funny," she said. Her voice did what voices are supposed to do when they belong to someone who intends to be heard. It carried without shouting. Heads turned. Edward smiled at Lena, like a man who had been interrupted from a game he expected to win. "Oh, come on, Lena, it's harmless." "Harmless?" Lena's eyes scanned the room, met each face with a question. "We make jokes about people we don't have to look in the eye. That's not harmless, that's cowardice." The room shifted. People turned back to their conversations like someone who had been asked to remember a debt. The energy thinned. A guest lowered a glass. Someone coughed and pretended not to be angry. Grant kept working. He folded a napkin and set it beside a plate. He did not want to be looked at. He had learned, over the years, the practical advantage of moving as if you were invisible. Not everyone enjoyed being crossed by someone's anger. Not everyone had the luxury of choosing the hill to die on, so he chose none at all. But memories do not care for chosen neutrality. They came up like scent. The arena lights were heat against his eyelids. He could hear the crowd in a different voice now, 1,000 echoes, a single roar. Once, the roar had been his coat. Once, the roar had been his currency. Once, he had been called champion and #1 in rooms packed with people who didn't know his name but knew his right hand and the way he kept his mouth shut until the bell. He saw Jack Morrison like a flash of white teeth and a laugh that came too easily. Jack was the kind of friend who would pull you up from the floor, crack a joke, and hand you his half of a sandwich when the world ate you for breakfast. Jack wore the world like someone borrowing it from a library, careful, reverent, and always returning on time. There was one night, an image that lived inside Grant like a scar that didn't show on the skin. A fight at the end of a long tour. A misjudged step, a glove that slipped where it shouldn't. The moment when speed outpaced thought. The sound of Jack landing wrong on the mat. The ambulance lights like two bright stars. The silence that followed, a country with no roads. Grant's hands had not been clean the night Jack fell. They had been doing the thing they were trained to do. The world said it was an accident. Grant called it a fault, his fault, and walked out of the arena with a promise on his breath, never to make violence his currency again. Since then, his hands had been full of other sacred things. A mop, a child's drawing of a family in crayon, a pair of small shoes to be mended at the sole. He had learned to measure his strength in the quiet ways that didn't bruise people. He had learned that power surrendered was not weakness, but a particular kind of law. Grant? Piper's voice, small, found him. He looked down and saw her cheek streaked with gravy, and the earnest way she tried to tuck a napkin into her lap. For a second, he wanted to take her into his arms and protect her from the architecture of the room, the way opulence builds itself like a fortress and invites people to throw stones from inside. He wanted to promise her that none of this would touch them, but promises cheap and made to the untrained ear would not be enough. He had to be teacher and parent both, lesson and soft place, and the idea felt heavier than any mop head he had ever swung. Lena moved closer to the head of the table. "You have a lot to say," Edward said, chin tilted. "Careful you don't get fired for giving an encore." "You know," Lena said, "some of us were raised to say thank you, not to prove a point by humiliating people who work." She paused, eyes on Grant. "If that man walked away, it would be a shame to lose his dignity tonight because it's fashionable to laugh." Her words landed like pebbles on water. The ripples were small, but in a room full of glass and good china, even a small ripple makes its presence known. Grant folded another napkin. He moved with the economy of someone who had learned to hide his center from sight. There were things inside his head that he kept in the dark. A photo of Jack taped behind the mirror of his small bathroom. A crumpled receipt from court. A girl's drawing of their apartment taped above the stove. He had never told Piper about what he used to do. He had never thought to tell her. How could he explain the way the world had once smelled like sweat and chlorinated water? How it had been louder and more dangerous and full of people who found meaning in the landing? He wanted Piper to think of him as something clean, not as something divided. Edward laughed again, soft and deliberate. "Isn't that cute?" he said to the table. "The lone protector of the rubbish, like he's proud of his Sunday chores." Another guest laughed, more out of momentum than malice. A pair of teenagers behind a candle flicked their eyes to their phones and scrolled. Someone whispered that the Radcliffes always threw the best parties. The advertisement of wealth works like an industry. It trains people to overlook the small cruelties because they are wrapped in satin. After the evening had been set into motion by a single cruel sentence, it kept moving. Cruelty finds its own inertia. Lena reached for the wine bottle and set it lower to the table. Her fingers brushed the stem, and for a second the crystal chimed like a bell. She cleared her throat. "I don't think anyone here knows this man," she said, turning her face to the room. "But that doesn't give us the right to make him the punchline." Edward's jaw tightened. He favored the half-smile of men who have been given the benefit of doubt for too long. "Are we defending janitors now?" He let the question hover. "What next? Are we all supposed to donate our fortunes?" There was the sharp sound of a fork hitting a plate. Someone attempted to laugh again. Grant looked up just enough to see the portrait at the head of the table. Charles Radcliffe, grandfather and paterfamilias, with a face chiseled by good decisions and firm hands. The portrait looked at Grant with a lack of curiosity that would have hurt less than the momentary confusion. Mr. Radcliffe, who'd opened his house to many causes, but never to people who needed shelter more than entertainment, sat at the center of the night's gravity like a man who had always presumed he could teach the world how to behave. Grant's spine felt the weight of the room like a pressure. He could leave. He could wipe a final inch of table, pick up the trash bag, and walk out into the cold with his pockets full of nothing and his heart full of the same old resolve. He had done it before. Walking away had been his form of penance, his proof he could live with his hands doing anything but damage. He also had choices he could not afford, and one of them was anger. A man with fists that had been trained in stadiums but who had nothing to prove to anyone anymore would be expected, some nights, to react with fury. That would be the story the internet would make anyway. Janitor humiliated, fights back, gets arrested. But Grant had spent years learning that victory purchased with harm does not look like victory at all. The true measure of a man, a voice in his head whispered, is knowing when to act and how. Around him, the room continued to provide sound. A fork scraped porcelain. A child said something interpretive about Christmas lights. Somewhere in the house, a grandfather clock counted out the second as if the world had not shifted at all. People live by familiar rhythms. They like their rituals and their jokes and their habit of assuming the worst about those who can least protect themselves. Grant's hands were nothing special to look at, thick, calloused, clean. But they knew the language of leverage and patience like someone fluent in an old tongue. They remembered balance. They remembered timing. Those memories were not romantic or mystical. They were muscle memory and the slow, stubborn knowledge that the body never forgets what the mind tries to bury. A guest at the far end of the table, an acquaintance of the family who happened to collect sports memorabilia, glanced across the room and saw the thin sliver of a ring that flashed when Grant straightened. It was almost invisible, a silver band, worn at the finger, scratched by years of work. Something in the guest's face changed. He squinted. "Is that?" he murmured, and his voice trailed off into a space that felt like recognition trying to find a name. Grant noticed a smell then, something like copper and bleach, and it tugged a string inside him that connected the present moment to a decade of other lives. He thought of Jack's laugh again and felt a sudden, guilty, private kinship with that memory. "Grant," Lena said quietly but deliberately across the stretch of polished table, "if anyone's going to be here after the party is cleaned up, it'll be him." Her words were not an accusation. They were an observation about the reality that people who do the work are the ones who stay behind to make things right. Edward's face tightened further. He had been enjoying himself, being the center of attention, the one who could make a man shift his shoulders and look small. Now the attention was different. The social ledger was being balanced minute by minute. People started to look at their glasses, their plates, the pattern of frost at the window. They were suddenly aware that moral actions were not just for the lower classes. They were for everyone. "You always have to turn it into a sermon," Edward said to Lena, but his voice had a softness beneath it, like a thread unraveling. He shifted his weight, the air around him stinging with the sense that his dominance had been interrupted. People started to look at their glasses, their plates, the pattern of frost at the window. They were suddenly aware that moral actions were not just for the lower classes. They were for everyone. "You always have to turn it into a sermon," Edward said to Lena, but his voice had a softness beneath it, like a thread unraveling. He shifted his weight, the air around him stinging with the sense that his dominance had been interrupted. Grant's hands, still, folded one more napkin. He was aware of the guest's eyes now with a clarity that made him think of cold weather. He did not like being seen by strangers. Under the dishes, life was a set of rules learned through necessity. You get up early, you work, you pay your rent a day at a time, you find moments of grace in small things. You do not presume you are owed dignity, you accept it when someone offers it. Someone at the table tapped on a smartphone. The bright screen cast a small blue light on a pretty hand. A photograph scrolled for a moment. An old magazine cover with a photograph of a young fighter in a ring, arms raised. The headline read something like, "Unbeaten, the rise of the city's favorite." The guest's thumb paused. A soft murmur moved through the table like wind through leaves. Grant did not move. But there were questions now in the room like tiny cracks in glass. People were starting to put together pieces they had not seen before. The scar, the quick way he stepped over spilled wine, the ring, the way his shoulders sat when he bent. A woman who ran a small local paper leaned forward and peered. "Does that ring mean anything?" she asked, as if asking for gossip rather than truth. Her curiosity had the flavor of someone who liked the idea of story more than the person inside it. Piper watched her father from the doorway. She had never seen him as anything but the man who fixed lights and told bedtime stories. A question rose in her like a spark. What if my dad is someone with a past he keeps like a secret box? What if there are parts of him that the world made him hide? Grant's stomach tightened. Memories rolled like old film. There was the night the bell rang, the roar of the crowd filling his ears with the sound of 10,000 mistakes. He saw Jack again, laughing like it was the easiest thing in the world. He saw the way the glove connected, and the way one small misalignment had unmade years of training. He had walked away because he couldn't imagine the sanctity of a life used as sport. He had walked away because his skin bore the map of that decision. He had sworn he would never again let his hands speak louder than his words. He had sworn to protect, not to preen. He had sworn to be a different kind of man for Piper. The vow had carried him through long, cold winters and through nights when rent notices arrived like small predators. Now the room had a new weight. Expectations shifted. Rumors fluttered like moths in a lamp. The magazine image had caught the eye of someone with a mind for connections. A guest murmured, then laughed nervously, then fell silent. People were beginning to put two and two together. The janitor, who didn't complain, and the photo from a decade ago on a glossy cover. Lena's decision to speak up had altered the equation. The laughter had thinned.
The party that had been a performance for a certain kind of status had become a small tribunal of social conscience.
Grant felt the change like wind off water. He finished his work. He rose with the mop handle balanced like a staff. The handle was worn smooth where his palm met it, an honest wear that told of repeated motion and time. He pressed the mop head into the bucket and let the water spin, silver and gray. The skimming sound of the mop across hardwood was suddenly loud in the room, as if the house had never heard such a simple, honest noise before. For him, the mop was both tool and talisman. It was the same object that had kept his hands busy when memories crowded in. Edward watched him with the disquiet of a man who notices a tool in a stranger's hand and imagines it might be a weapon. "You have something to say now?" Edward called, too loud. Grant held the mop for a second longer than he needed to. He could have walked out. He could have left the trash to the night and gone home to the small apartment where Piper's drawings were taped to the wall. He thought of Jack's laughter and of the ambulance lights. He thought of the way his hands had trembled the night he decided violence was no longer a measure he wanted. He thought of the little girl who looked up at him as if the whole world might be fixed with a single hug. Lena's gaze flicked between Edward and Grant. "Maybe so," she said softly. "Maybe it's time someone remembered how to be kind." The room breathed. The sound of cutlery resumed, but without the careless abandon that had started the night. People were looking now like they had just been shown a mirror. Grant took a step. It was a small, measured motion, like something someone does when lifting a child or when setting a heavy pot on the stove. He did not move with the suddenness of rage. His body carried the slow assurance of a man who had practiced restraint like a ritual. He stepped into the room's center, into a space that felt absurd for him to occupy. The dining table seemed to hold its breath. Lights above flickered in the reflection of chandeliers. Conversation stopped, as if someone had cut the cord of sound. When he straightened, the room took him in with the confused tenderness one reserves for an animal who has wandered into a banquet hall. People shifted chairs. Piper stepped forward, and then stopped, as if pulled by an invisible leash. Lena stood like a woman about to cross a thin line. Edward laughed, the laugh of a man who thinks the moment is still his. "Is this your big moment, Coat?" he called. "What are you gonna do, sweep the floor with him?" For a moment, Grant looked like a man listening to wind. His jaw did not clench. His hands did not tense the way a fighter's hands would if he planned to strike. He held the mop as he would hold a child's hand against the cold. He heard the echo of Jack's voice somewhere under the hum of the room, a memory like a low drum. He remembered pain and regret and the vow that had shaped the last years. He had not come to this house to be a spectacle. He did not want to be proof of anyone else's bravado, but he also could not bear to be the target of a cruelty that presented itself as sport. He took a breath that tasted like steam and lemon. He moved forward another step. The whole room watched him with the slow disapproval of people who had just been told a small, uncomfortable truth. There was a tightness in his chest that felt like the beginning of a storm. He knew he had to choose exactly how to answer. He had to make a decision that would not undo his promise, but would also not let humiliation slide like oil off a spoon. He had to be someone who taught, not someone who punished. People expect one of two things when a man like Grant moves into the center of a room: either a plea or an explosion. He had walked away from both for a reason. He had believed that the world needed another kind of strength, the kind that could take the floor and refuse to break, the kind that could show power as a shelter rather than a sword. At that moment, the music that had been a low background of carols and strings faded into nothing. A single fork clinked against a plate. The house seemed to hold its breath. Grant's hands rested on the mop handle as if it were a cane. He looked at Edward, saw the old arrogance, the practiced amusement, and then at the gathered guests, the faces that had laughed and the faces that had not. He opened his mouth. He did not shout. He did not raise his voice beyond what the room could hold. The words he chose would not change the past, but they might change the arc of something that felt broken tonight. "People like to assume a lot," he said, voice low, steady. "They assume they know who I am because I sweep their floors. They assume they know how I feel about being made small. They assume they can make a joke and walk away." A silence settled, heavy and careful. Grant let it sit. The house listened like it had been waiting for the right cadence. He thought of Piper's small face, of the way she had stopped breathing when the laughter started, and of the promise that had kept him from being someone else. "I used to be someone else," he said, and in the hush, his voice was not a confession, but a quiet truth. He looked at Edward and at the guests, the way someone would look at witnesses. "What do you mean?" Lena asked, softly. Grant's hands tightened involuntarily on the mop. He could tell the story of the arena tonight, of the lights, of Jack, of the accident. He could tell them everything, lay it out like plates on the table. But some things are not meant to be served to strangers under Christmas lights. He would not dramatize his guilt for applause. He would not pull at a wound to test public compassion. Instead, he chose a different route. He chose the small, precise truth that there had been a life he left behind, that his hands had known a different work, that he carried the memory of a friend like a weight he would always feel. "I used to be someone else," he said, and in the hush, his voice was not a confession, but a quiet truth. He looked at Edward and at the guests, the way someone would look at witnesses. "What do you mean?" Lena asked, softly. Grant's hands tightened involuntarily on the mop. He could tell the story of the arena tonight, of the lights, of Jack, of the accident. He could tell them everything, lay it out like plates on the table. But some things are not meant to be served to strangers under Christmas lights. He would not dramatize his guilt for applause. He would not pull at a wound to test public compassion. Instead, he chose a different route. He chose the small, precise truth that there had been a life he left behind, that his hands had known a different work, that he carried the memory of a friend like a weight he would always feel. "That's enough," Edward said, but his voice had the thinness of a man hearing the first notch in his own armor. He glanced at his grandfather portrait, as if seeking counsel from painted eyes. "You're not the only one who knows how to stand," Grant added. The words were soft but precise, like the touch of a hand on a shoulder. No one moved. The room had shifted from a stage to a courtroom and back to something in between. People were starting to search their own faces for the reflection of a kindness they hadn't given. They were starting to feel a faint but growing discomfort with the idea that their laughter had been a show of cruelty. A guest near the window, the one with the sports memorabilia, brought up his phone and tapped the screen again. The glossy photograph of a young man raised in victory had been enough to ignite gossip. A series of messages passed like a current. Someone whispered, then another, as if a rumor was rediscovering itself. Piper took a step closer to her father. She watched his eyes, the way they did not seek vengeance, and for the first time she saw him as a whole person, flawed, dignified, capable of both silence and action. She felt the tug of pride and fear in the same measured beat. Grant set the mop down beside the bucket. The sound of the handle hitting the rim was a small punctuation. He folded his hands in front of him. He could have turned and walked out then, the room balanced on the edge of a decision about what would come next. But there was a seam he could not ignore, the seam between what people assumed and what they knew. He wanted to cut it in a way that would not hurt the fragile music of someone's life. "Before you laugh," he said, and the words reached everyone, "think about what you would do if someone you love were there, watching you choose humiliation over mercy." For a second, it felt like the world held its breath again. Edward's face was something unreadable,
annoyance mixed with the first seeds of shame. The guests shuffled. The chandelier above reflected 100 little lights like stars, all suddenly dimmed. Grant saw Lena look at him with something that might be gratitude. He caught a glimpse of the sports collector's brows knitting as he put two images together. He saw Piper's chest rise with the slow exhale of a child relieved. He made a choice then, not about revenge, but about the kind of man he wanted to be for his daughter and for himself. He stepped forward another fraction of a pace, into the center of the room proper, into the stronger light. People leaned away as if the air had cooled. The hush that followed was thick enough to cut. No one moved when he did. No one laughed. Edward swallowed and straightened his tie. The table seemed to lean toward the edge of its social order, uncertain whether to hold its position or crumble. Grant inhaled again.
He felt the history in his bones, the arena in the blood. The choice years of atonement had carved into his manner. He did not raise a fist. He did not call a name. He held himself like someone who had been taught the discipline to use force only to save, not to shame. A guest near the head of the table, the woman with the magazine, whispered something into her companion's ear. "He was famous once," she said, like it was an irrelevant fact, and yet the words fell into the room like rain. People started to look at him not as a joke, but as a person with a past and a story. The reaction was not immediate, not theatrical. It unfolded like a bloom. First a blank, then a pause, then the slow spreading of comprehension. Edward's smile thinned into a line. He had to decide how to respond to the fact that the man he had made small had a history that did not fit the narrative of entertainment he'd constructed. Grant's voice, when he spoke again, was quieter. He would not let his history be used as leverage to humiliate others. He would not allow his past to become a spectacle. He would not let himself become a cautionary tale for someone else's amusement. "I don't want your pity," he said, and the words were level, not pleading. "I don't want anyone to make me small for your entertainment. You can throw me a laugh, or you can give me the dignity to stand." As the words dissolved into the room, the household music cut out altogether, like someone had turned a dial. A fork fell somewhere near the head of the table and clattered against a plate. For a moment, the house was a single held breath. That was where the night tilted. People started to shuffle in their chairs. Some faces softened, others hardened. A current of recognition began to travel around the table. Recognition not just of a past life, but of the kind of man who chose to stand with restraint when the world expected him to strike. Grant had not planned to do anything dramatic. He had planned only to show he could stand. But standing in that room was dangerous in its own way. It risked more humiliation if he lost his temper. It risked misinterpretation if he remained silent. It risked nonsense headlines if anyone misconstrued his restraint as weakness. He was aware of the small camera lights that lived in people's phones now, of the way any movement could be filmed and turned into minutes of someone else's story. He had learned long ago that public narratives had the power to hurt people more than fists. He kept his face small and steady, like a man whose business was not to perform for crowds, but to be present for his daughter. Outside, a snowflake tapped against the window, like someone knocking on the glass. Inside, the table hummed with a collective decision about what kind of story tonight would be. Grant felt something else then, a small, stubborn thread of resolve that wasn't about the world watching, but about what kind of father he would be when Piper asked him what he'd done. He thought of telling her truth without shame, of teaching her how to hold herself when others tried to make her less. He thought of the small house with its crooked lights and the single bed where Piper slept like someone who trusted. He shifted his weight, and the light caught the scar on his jaw. A guest at the end of the table leaned forward, curiosity bright. The magazine on the table was turned toward the guests now, the image of a young fighter frozen mid-celebration. Someone whispered, "Isn't that him?" And the words started a new movement around the room.
The air tasted of lemon and of a time when things could still be decided by the manner of a man rather than the volume of his anger. Grant stood there, mop at his side, and the world seemed to hold open a sliver of possibility. He would not strike to humiliate. He would not gloat. But he also would not leave the moment to be consumed by someone else's cruelty. He knew how to end a challenge without breaking a person. He had practiced restraint like a craft. He had learned that the most effective form of power is the one that refuses to degrade. He took a step forward, and the room leaned in. The decisive move, what it would look like, how the crowd would respond, hung over the table like snow before a fall. People held their breath, gathering themselves for a motion that promised to change the night's shape. That is where the evening paused, with a man in a janitor's coat at the center of an opulent room, with a child watching, with a cousin who had spoken up, with a crowd suddenly learning to hold its laughter, with a ring worn on a finger that had once been raised in victory, with a history that was being reassembled one small, deliberate truth at a time. Outside the windows, the snow thickened. Inside, someone hit record on a phone, thinking of clicks and views. But the moment itself was not about spectacle. It was about a choice: to answer cruelty with cruelty, or to show the kind of strength that heals. Grant let the silence swell. He felt the history of Jack and the Knights of Atonement like a tide on his chest. He imagined, for the briefest second, the simplest outcome: that someone would stand beside him, not to defend him with fists, but to take up the gentler work of apology. He looked at Edward and set his jaw in a way that did not invite violence, but did not cower. He thought of the mop in his hands, and of the small, clever moves he had used in the ring once to redirect force rather than meet it head-on. He thought of the way leverage works: a small nudge in the right place, a motion that uses an opponent's own weight against him. It was not magic, it was physics, it was timing. The room watched as he breathed in. He had decided, in a way he could explain to his daughter, that whatever happened next would not betray the promise he had made years ago in a hospital hallway with Jack's hand in his. Grant stepped forward, a quiet man in a loud house, and the world waited to see whether restraint could be spectacular enough to shame a rich man's arrogance without hurting anyone. Grant moved with the sort of patience built by years of small, repetitive rescue, hands that had learned to coax stains out of rugs, to unstick a jammed drawer, to steady a shaky table leg until the wobble was gone. He stepped to Edward as if approaching someone who might topple. He closed the space between them like a man who had practiced closing gaps without force. Edward's smirk stayed stubbornly in place, a practiced defiance designed to rile an audience. He didn't see the care behind Grant's approach. He saw only a target. For the space of a breath, the room hung in perfect quiet, like a held note. The faint whir of the dishwasher in the kitchen faded. A candle guttered somewhere, and its flame bent as if listening. Grant reached for Edward's arm, not to grab, not to hurt, but to find the place where leverage lived. He touched him the way you touch a clock's face to set the hand straight, deliberate, precise, intimate. Edward pulled at the provocation, an instinct, a performance. He tried to turn the moment into a spectacle the way he'd turned Grant into one earlier. He stepped forward, an instinctive shove meant to show dominance. Grant used that forward motion. He pivoted gently, guiding Edward's momentum in a small, clean arc. There was no swing. There was the lightest of contacts, a touch on the elbow, a guiding pressure that redirected the man's balance. Edward stumbled, as if the floor had shifted. He reached for a chair, missed it, and his polished shoe scuffed the rug. He landed against the edge of the table with a hollow sound that felt too loud in a room suddenly stripped of pretense. It was over in the space of a second and felt like an eternity. Edward's face changed with a speed the guests hadn't expected. Confusion, then shock, then a red bloom of humiliation that had nothing to do with bruises. He wasn't injured, he hadn't been struck. There were no dramatic spins or viral clips of a fight. There was only the image of a man who had tried to make someone small and discovered the world could turn on him. Phones pinged, one camera light blinked on. Someone who'd been smiling for the punchline found breathless silence instead. At the head of the table, Charles Radcliffe's portrait seemed to watch the scene with ancient patience. Edward slid down the table's edge until he was sitting on the floor, the wine forgotten in his hand. He looked like a man who had fallen out of a story he'd been starring in for years and was unsure how to get back on stage. Grant's chest was a steady metronome. He could feel Piper's small presence at his side. She had edged forward until the kitchen doorway framed her body like a painting. Lena stood, hands clenched at her sides, the color in her cheeks bright with the surge of doing what was right.
"No one needed to get hurt," Grant said, voice even. He could have made the point sharper. He could have let his past become a weapon for his own pride. He kept the edges soft. "That wasn't what I came here for." Edward's face crumpled in a way that did not look theatrical. It looked human. What are you?" he stammered, not yet naming the possibility that the man he had mocked had been something more than he assumed. A woman near the fire reached for her phone and turned it toward Edward. The glossy cover that had floated around earlier was larger on her screen now. The fighter in the photograph, young, bronzed, arms raised, bore a resemblance the room could no longer ignore. Someone said a name, a half-formed recognition, and then the name became a few texts sent under breaths. Grant Miller, undefeated. Champion Miller, 2 decades ago. The boy who walked out. The rumor knitted itself into fact as a guest called up an archive. A headline appeared on a screen. "Boxing's golden boy walks away after friend's death." It wasn't a sensational scoop, it was a factual ledger. A name, a date, a short clipping noting that the man had disappeared from the spotlight after an accident. The pages of memory unfurled in real time. The silence, once full of judgment, became full of curiosity and shame. Edward's eyes traced the image and then darted to Grant's hands, to the tiny silver ring on his finger, to the scar at the jaw that caught the chandelier's light. Faces in the room rearranged themselves as if deciding whether to be critics or to be witnesses. Slowly, people began to look at Grant with a new kind of attention, one that felt like apology in its first stumbling steps. "Is that?" someone whispered, and the question was not a weapon anymore. It asked for truth. Grant could have amplified the reveal. He could have stood on the narrative he'd left behind and let strangers clamber for the drama. He chose not to. His life had been pared down to essentials: Piper's safety, a roof, the promise he'd made to himself at a hospital corridor and carried like a stone in his pocket. Tonight, he would not trade that promise for an audience. "I used to fight," Grant said, simply. He let the words hang, not to dramatize, but to settle truth into the room like a new, steady object everyone had to navigate around. "I stopped. I left because I couldn't live with what we were making of people." That phrase, "what we were making of people," landed differently than any flourish would have. A guest, the sports collector, tapped tablets and paged photographs, then looked up as if seeing a face he remembered from another life. Another, younger woman, pressed her fingertips to her mouth. There was a soft intake of breath, like someone closing a book and realizing they'd been blurring the pages. Edward sat on the floor, the humiliation of his fall mirrored in the paling of his face. He swallowed. "I meant," he started, and then the sentence unraveled. He had meant to be funny. He had meant to stitch together a joke. He had meant to show that he could direct the room. He had not expected to be unmasked in front of family and their guests. Suddenly, the stage had peeled away and left him nakedly small. Lena stepped forward into the thin, quiet space between apology and resistance. She did not move with triumph. She moved with a steadiness like someone who'd borne witness and would not allow the moment to be swallowed by spectacle. "You made him a joke," she said, eyes fixed on Edward.
You thought it would be funny. People left to clean up more than this room. They left with feeling less than human. You owe him that, more than a laugh." Edward's jaw worked. He looked at Grant as if trying to find the seam that could reopen his performance. He stammered. He wanted to fix it with words, with money, with an easy apology. There is a particular shame when your habitual tools, money, charm, cannot simply smooth a wrong. Grant watched him and felt a familiar ache that had nothing to do with his shoulder or his jaw. It was something like the old hospital nights when machines hummed for people you loved and you couldn't barter with the world. He saw in Edward not just an enemy, but a person who had never been taught how to be small without buying the room's favor. "You can apologize," Grant said, "and you should. But you can also do something that looks like the apology you owe." He spoke without bitterness. He was teaching in the only way he'd known to teach without violence. You can show up for the people you make small. You can learn what it means to serve without losing your dignity. The room shifted. Edward looked at his family's faces, in the reflective eyes, in the set of shoulders, and saw something new: expectation. This family, he realized, had the means to do restitution. He had used those means to perform status. He could use them now to repair. The thought made him dizzy. He rose slowly from the floor, shaking. Apology came first as a breath, and then as words, halting and real. "Grant," he said, voice rawer than the forced bonhomie he'd used all evening. I'm sorry. That was cruel. I thought it would be funny. He broke off. It was the first time since he was a child that he couldn't assemble a charming sentence. The family around him shifted, some nodding, some avoiding eye contact. Grant watched the apology, measuring it like someone deciding whether to accept a gift. He remembered Jack's face in the ring, remembered how the last thing Jack had shrugged about had been a joke. He thought of Piper, and how he wanted her to understand that apologies could be a beginning, not an eraser. "Say it again," he told Edward, gently. "Say it like you mean it." Edward let himself be steadied into the shape of humility. He spoke his apology again, more slowly, naming the things he'd done wrong: the joke, the mockery, the idea that someone's work could make him less.
He promised, in front of the people who mattered, to do better. He reached into the pockets of a role he had known for years, patron, leader, decision-maker, and pulled out an offering. It was clumsy, nervous, but it was a start. An offer to fund a neighborhood program, to open his family's building for a weekly community dinner, to hire local staff on fair wages. The words spilled, tripping over themselves, because they'd had to be found in a place Edward hadn't visited before, his own conscience. For Lena, watching him fumble toward restitution was like watching someone learn to breathe after they'd been held underwater. She stepped in and said what the moment required, not of grand gestures, but of accountability. "It's not enough to fund things," she said. "You have to be part of them. You have to learn what people actually need, not what looks good on a donation plaque. Start by coming here on Saturdays, help clean up, listen." Edward's face, already softened by the unglamorous task of apology, went still. The idea of being present without being served, a dangerous humility, terrified him and, in a small way, relieved him. He had been very good at being seen. He was not good at being useful without cameras. He agreed, clumsily, and the sound of his voice carried the first honest note of the evening. The guests around the table began to shift, too. Conversations resumed, not the frivolous chatter of earlier, but smaller, more cautious acknowledgments. Heads bent toward plates, but now there was a new thing on the table: the sense that a mistake had been made and could be mended. People rose to leave in twos and threes, offering quiet apologies of their own, words that hung like small stitches. Some slipped Grant a note of apology folded into a napkin. Others avoided him, as if they didn't want to be reminded of the way community had failed him.
All of it moved in the orbit of the change Edward had been forced to face. Grant accepted the apologies he felt were genuine. He did not stand as a judge. He stood as a man who had learned to accept the work of repair slowly, in increments. "I'm not a public story," he said softly, to no one in particular. "I'm someone's father. I'm someone who sweeps up at the end of the night because someone has to. If this ends with us being kinder, then tonight was worth it." Piper's face split into a small, surprised smile. She stepped forward and took her father's hand, fingers small and warm. The simple contact was enough to still the room further. People who had come for a spectacle had instead watched a family reclaim what was theirs: dignity, private and unshowy. That night, in the weeks that followed, small things happened that were not televised. Edward kept his promise. He showed up on a rainy Saturday to help move boxes at a neighborhood shelter. He didn't parade his help, he simply learned the muscle of seeing without offering lectures.
The Radcliffe Foundation, prodded by Lena's oversight, funded a community kitchen with living wage jobs, and the family office agreed to a new policy. Staff would be included in family events not as entertainment but as guests. Grant found himself at the center of a different kind of attention. A local reporter who'd been at the party wrote a short piece that didn't need a clickbait headline. It was a small, respectful story about a man who had left fame to raise his daughter, and the night he was made the subject of a cruel joke. It told neither scandal nor triumph. It told a human truth, and it reached people who lived nearby, people who had once cheered at Edward's father's barbecues and had never thought their laughter might sting someone. Messages came, some awkward, some sincere, from neighbors who offered to help with childcare or groceries on rainy weeks. A retired coach called and asked if Grant would teach a self-discipline class at the community center. He refused at first, then thought of Piper's small face and the way she had looked up at him during the humiliation and changed his mind. Grant began, tentatively, to talk about his past with a select few. He told Lena a version of the story that left out the worst textures of the memory but did not deny the weight he carried. It was a conversation about how he had loved the sport and how he'd loved Jack, and about the single moment that had rewritten his life. He did not ask for pity. He asked for an understanding that could not be manufactured by anyone who had not been in those hospital corridors. On a cold Tuesday, months later, he stood in a converted parish hall where a sign now read, "Radcliffe Community Kitchen and Learning Center." There was a small ring of children and teens before him, faces alert and skeptical. The floor smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and hope. Grant set a water bottle in the center and kicked his shoes more gently than he used to before practice. He taught them balance and timing, not punching. He taught them how to fall without hurting someone else. He taught them how to hold a presence in a room. He taught them that strength could be a shelter. The lessons were practical: how to stand so a bully's shove becomes a ripple, not a shove back; how to use balance to escape a tight corner, not to injure; how to make your body a quiet classroom. The kids learned quickly. Some of them had been pushed around by classmates, some had never been taught to trust their own bodies. Piper sat on the sidelines sometimes, sketching the kids like she used to sketch houses in crayon, and watched her father with a steady pride that didn't need fanfare. Edward came to one of the classes that spring, small and clumsy in his sneakers, apologizing to the kids for being late. He sat at the back and opened his hands to listening. He spent afternoons in the kitchen, chopping vegetables beside the staff rather than ordering them. He listened to the people he'd once used as props. The meals he helped prepare still tasted faintly of his family's old wealth, but now other hands had given the recipe. He learned to let others have the spotlight. One afternoon, a local TV station ran a short feature on the center. They didn't dramatize Grant's past. They showed his hands teaching a girl to keep her balance. They showed Piper stacking bowls, smiling like any 10-year-old who'd watched a parent take a hard night and make it better. Edward appeared on camera, awkward and honest, and said the kinds of things people say when they're starting to care. The town's response was measured.
People came who had never been to a Radcliffe event. Old resentments faded like the last snow in spring. A few of the more cynical voices remained, the ones for whom change is always suspicious by default. Grant learned to let them stand where they stood. He didn't need everyone to agree. He needed the people who mattered, his daughter, a few friends, and a handful of hopeful teens, to see that a wrong could be made right by steady labor rather than spectacle. There were visits he never expected. An old opponent from his boxing days stopped by one afternoon, a large man with hands like the trunks of trees and a laugh that filled rooms. He came not to spar, but to volunteer in the workshop where young people learned carpentry. "I heard someone throws a good lesson about balance," the man announced, and the kids cheered. He sat next to Grant and spoke of Jack, how he remembered the man who died as a friend, not as a headline. They shared a quiet drink later and spoke in the odd code only men who'd been in the ring together understand, a shorthand of regret, apology, and the slow work of making peace. Jack's memory never left Grant. There were nights he'd wake with the taste of hospital air at the back of his throat and the old self's guilt buzzing like a live wire. He went to the grave sometimes and left a small bouquet, the same brand of daisies Jack used to crush in his fist as a joke. He didn't pray for forgiveness the way some people do. He performed it by the meticulous, repeated acts of care he gave to others. He taught kids how to control their force, not use it. He taught them how to leave an argument with their dignity intact. He taught them how to clean up after a party without bitterness. The Radcliffes, too, changed shape. Charles Radcliffe, seeing his family's name associated with something gentler, made public efforts to tie the estate to neighborhood causes. He visited the center once, a quiet man whose face had always been carved with the gravity of a family head. He stood in the hall, hands clasped, and watched a class. Afterward, he found Grant sitting on a crate, tying a shoelace. The two men exchanged a few words, few but honest. "I didn't know the man I thought I knew," Charles said, not with accusation, but with the honest voice of someone learning. "We were taught to lead by commanding. You've taught us to lead by helping. Thank you."
Grant nodded. He understood now that influence could be a kind of repair. He did not ask for praise. He only wanted people to be less ready to laugh at someone else's expense. One winter evening, the center held its first anniversary dinner. The Radcliffes provided the hall. The volunteers cooked. People sat at long tables and talked about the year's changes, the jobs found, the kids who'd finished their courses, the lives adjusted. Edward gave a short speech that wasn't about himself. He spoke about learning to apologize and to listen. He named Grant's work in front of everyone and then stepped down, embarrassed by the attention but sustained by the truth of it. At the end of the night, when the guests had gone and only volunteers remained to stack chairs, Edward approached Grant with a reserved expression. He extended his hand, an old-fashioned gesture that felt symbolic after so many rough words. "Thank you," he said simply. Grant looked at him for a moment longer than politeness required. There was a lot to say, a dozen condemnations and half a dozen reasons to be less forgiving. He also understood something about the small work of holding a child's future. He reached out and took Edward's hand. The handshake was firm, but not theatrical. It was the real, quiet seal of two men who'd been led into a new lesson. "You still have a lot to learn," Grant said, with a small, almost fatherly tone. Edward laughed softly, relieved. "Yes," he admitted, "but I'm trying." They stood like that for a moment, two men who'd stood at different corners of a wide room and had decided to build a bridge. The center's lights hummed gently. Outside, snow tapped the windows in a pattern like applause. Piper, who had been half helping and half watching all evening, slipped from behind a stack of chairs and hugged her father without the least bit of performance. "You were brave," she told him, in the way children tell the truth bluntly and without varnish. "I liked that you didn't hurt him." Grant's throat tightened. There was gratitude in that simple sentence that had nothing to do with public validation.
It had everything to do with the small human economy he'd chosen to live in. At home that night, he put Piper to bed and sat for a long while in the dim kitchen, the small house lit by the crooked string of lights she insisted on. The past would always be there. The promise he'd made at Jack's bedside would sit like an old coin in his pocket. He had learned to spend it on things that mattered: presence, patience, and the stubborn choice not to let shame define him. He thought of the night at the Radcliffe table, the way laughter had started like a wave and almost became a cliff. He thought of Lena's voice that had pulled the room back to itself. He thought of the simple physics he'd used to stop a man without hurting him. He thought of how power, when used to protect rather than spectacle, changes the world more effectively. The change wasn't romantic.
There were days when old accusations surfaced, when someone online wrote a flippant post, when a donor backed out. But there were more days when someone from the neighborhood would come by with bread or with a child's homework, asking if Grant could sit with their son for 10 minutes and teach him how to keep his balance. Those small requests, practical, unglamorous, were the currency he now valued most. Years later, people still mentioned the Christmas dinner in hushed tones. Some told the story as a morality tale about humility. Others remembered it as an evening when a child learned that her father could be both wounded and honorable. The Radcliffes kept a small plaque in the center, not as a trophy, but as a record, in memory of the night we learned to listen. If a stranger asked Grant what he thought about the chain of events, he would shrug and speak in a voice made of simple, sharp truth. "People make mistakes," he'd say. "What matters is what you do after." And if someone asked Piper, she would grin and say, "My dad taught me how to stand. He told me to be the kind of person who helps others up, not the kind who laughs when they fall." She would say it like a child reciting a small creed, pure and unembellished. The story that began with a cruel joke at an ornate table ended not with a viral video or a sensational headline, but with the slow, patient work of rebuilding. A man who had once traded blows for recognition learned to trade time for repair. A wealthy family learned to accompany its money with presence. A daughter learned to be proud of the quiet heroism of parenthood. A neighborhood learned that dignity is not a privilege, but a practice. On a clear morning some months after the first dinner, Grant watched a group of kids run across the center's floor, shoes skidding on a patch of spilled water, and laughed out loud, the sound bright and unashamed. Piper tugged at his sleeve. "Race you," she challenged, and he pretended to be slow, then caught her at the line with a gentle, practiced movement that left her giggling on the floor. He helped her up. The center's bell chimed for lunch. Volunteers moved in fluid, unforced patterns. Edward rinsed a pot he didn't have to, smiling at someone who'd once been beneath his notice. Grant lifted a cup of coffee and held it to his lips. The steam fogged his glasses for a second. He thought of Jack, and a small ache warmed the space again, the kind of ache that comes from having loved and having been taught to carry loss without letting it harden you. He thought of all the choices he'd made to master restraint. The nights of silence, the decision not to strike back, the steady teaching of a girl who believed he could be both gentle and resolute. True strength, he told a newcomer who'd asked him what the center aimed to teach, is not about winning every fight. It's about knowing when not to fight. It's about standing up for someone without making them smaller in the process. It's about using what you have to keep people safe, not to prove you're better. The newcomer nodded, and then they returned to the day's work. Outside, a snowflake hit the window and slid away. Inside, a room full of people made something together. A reputation for care instead of spectacle, for presence instead of pretense. The memory of that night, once a story of humiliation, had been remade into a lesson about mercy and repair. The rich family had misstepped and then learned. Public shame had turned into private effort, and a janitor's dignity had been rediscovered, not stolen back by force, but restored by the quieter, harder art of steady living. If you were moved by Grant's story, let us know which moment stayed with you most, and consider subscribing for more stories about quiet courage and the work of making things right.